It's a delight to be with all of you. I'm really excited about this conversation today. It occurred to me that I'm alone up here, and so it's time to bring up our panelists. I'm going to introduce them while they're on stage, but why don't you guys come on up? Taleeb, Nicholas, come on up. Shamira, come on up. Yeah. Hi. You guys look great. I'm so happy to be doing this with you. Listen, before we get into the conversation, let me just tell you a little bit about our esteemed panelists today. Taleeb Noormohamed is the MP for Vancouver Granville. He went to Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford, which is outrageous to me. I believe they call that a bingo. That's what they call that? He's also the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage. Fun fact, his Princeton advisor was Toni Morrison. Do you know that? That's what I said.
Sure.
Yeah, I like to bring up fun facts about people. Nicholas is the Star's immigration reporter, has been the Star's immigration reporter for 20 years, since 2003. As you can imagine, in that period of time, immigration has changed a lot in this country. How we talk about immigration has changed a lot in this country. Nicholas has won awards for his work. He's been a finalist for so many journalism prizes. I'm excited that you're here. And Shamira is Managing Director Canada for World Education Services. She was in government for more than 2 decades, including as ADM. She designed government programs. She has taught at UFT. She's taught at my alma mater, which is Queen's University. Hey, I'm excited that you're here too. I think to just set up the conversation, I want to refer back to this notion that we're working through difficult and fractured times. I'm a writer. I'm a writer first, and part of being a writer first means trying to look for narratives. And so some of the narratives that I wanted to assemble today as a journey is I wanted to talk about where we are now, how we got here, and then where we're going. That's generally the structure that we're going to follow today. And maybe, Nick, I'll start with you on this one. We were talking last night about the relatively recent poll from Environics. I can never say the name of the poll.
Environics.
Thank you. And the idea that the popularity of immigration has dropped. And I said to you, Nicholas, this is quite wild. I don't think I can remember a time before where the popularity of immigration, how well immigration polls with the Canadian public, has ever fallen in popularity. And you said it's never happened before. So can you just contextualize how significant this moment is for us when we see those numbers?
I really think that we are at a turning point right now. There are opportunities, there are challenges. Opportunities being that we finally also include immigration in our thinking when we talk about housing, when we talk about education, access to health care. This is the opportunity for us all to think outside of those silos that we use to think of immigration. But obviously, I think in terms of the public opinion polls, historically, I think we have successfully built a narrative about immigration. We're proud of that heritage when we think of Canada as a welcoming country, is a very strong humanitarian values. We open our doors to refugees, after the world wars, during the Vietnam War. There are opportunities to collaborate even more, to include immigration more in our thinking, in our mindset. But also, we have to be mindful of any potential backlashes against newcomers, especially refugees.
I can't tell if you're optimistic.
I'm realistic.
Okay.
But also optimistic.
What a reporterly answer. I can't just dive into optimism. Nicholas, I'm glad you brought that up, because Shamira, where I was going to go next with this, is that we'd like to tell a story. We'd like to tell a story in this country about our relationship to immigration. It's the thing that Nicholas just laid out, the idea that it aligns with our values. We're talking about generosity. We're talking about global leadership. We're talking about just general kindness. We do like to tell that story, and it's a convincing story. We like to tell that story, and it's easier to buy that story at a time when you have a workforce that is 7 workers to 1 retiree. When you have an aging population where your ratio is something closer to 3 workers for every retiree. In Atlantic Canada, it's about 2 workers for every retiree. Wow. You have to start thinking about it a little bit differently. I think we have seen a shift towards thinking about immigration as a force of human capital. Can you just trace back that shift for me? When did we start to think of it as more so in terms of human capital than it is about this sort of grander values thinking?
Sure. What I first want to do is just build on something that Nicholas said around the recent polling.
Yeah.
What came back as a response wasn't necessarily that we are anti-immigration, although that's where the narrative is starting to go.
Sure.
It was more the capacity of the country to bring in the number of immigrants that are coming. So I think that's important in terms of the nuances, although, you know, Nicholas, I agree that we are starting to get into buying into this negative narrative. In terms of the question you're asking me and when did it shift, basically my perspective is that when government makes policies, the policies are always based on what has happened in the past and then trying to predict what the future is going to look like. And so I think initially immigration was all about, you know, Canada is an open country, we need diversity, bring people in, and they will integrate. And then as time went on, there were barriers that basically came up for individuals coming in. So we turned the conversation into human capital. What we needed to do is assign points. And the point system was very much based on, you know, your age criteria, basically what you could contribute to the country, etc. And it worked for a little bit, because in fact, what we started doing is bringing a lot more highly skilled immigrants under the age of 42, who over time did start contributing, and we did well. What has happened now as a result of a number of things, COVID, automation, and generally just the ability of the absorption of the number of immigrants who are coming in.
Sure.
Bring in basically the large number of international students who can now enter the labor market at many, many hours. Bring in a large number of refugees. All of a sudden, the narrative changes from Canada is open to immigration to we have turned the narrative into it's all about groups. And different groups need different services, and the whole competition stage that's starting to play out in our own country. And so in my mind, we need to take the conversation back to what is immigration all about? Why did we even start bringing immigration and immigrants in? And where do we want to go in the future? So, you know, the key message here is let's not keep on talking about what has happened in the past. It's where does this country want to go in the future for long-term sustainability? And I've got data. I love data. You know, I'll read them out to you if you have time. But it's really important to understand that data is going to control what's going to happen in the future. You want me to talk about data?
Yeah, definitely why you talk about data.
Love
Please.
data.
Yeah.
Okay, so many of you in the audience, and you're here for a reason, because you hopefully understand the whole issue of demographic data. So by 2030, it's only 6 years from now, felt like a long time ago last year, 5 million Canadians are set to retire. It's around the corner. And the worker to retiree ratio will drop from 3-to-1, generally, nationally, to 2-to-1 by 2068. Although it sounds like it's far away, that is just telling you who is going to be in the labor force. Canadians, including immigrants, once they feel settled, are having fewer children. It's expensive, you know, they're just working to survive. So the average is 1.2 children per family. And so that's basically the full context. And when you look at the economy and the labor market, we have almost 800,000 vacancies at all levels across the country. It varies obviously by province in terms of the occupation, varies by regions, but that's 800,000 vacancies where you don't have enough people to fill jobs. And when you look at the kind of jobs that are required now, the future, automation, transformation, and we are competing globally, and we don't want to outsource, we want to try and keep the jobs here. And so therefore, when you think about the labor market and why we need immigrants, the immigrants who are coming in now are resilient, they're agile, they're globally connected and very highly educated, and they're nimble. They left their countries, they left everything to come here and basically contribute. And they face all kinds of barriers. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means for us.
We're going to come back to those barriers for sure. Taleeb, maybe we never get someone from the government to talk about this stuff, which is really useful. You know, we kind of go like, well, why are these targets increasing so much? I wish there was someone who could answer that. Well, you're here. I think there's a general understanding that in order for this country to continue to sustain its growth, immigration has to be a part of that answer. I don't want to root us too much in that dropping support for immigration, but it's worth talking about, it's worth reflecting that at this moment of need, we're also seeing some public opinion sort of shift against it. And a great deal of the argument against seems to be about preparation. Were we prepared to ramp up our immigration targets as much as we did? So maybe you can speak to why this felt like the moment to go to 500,000 people a year.
Well, I think, first of all, the poll itself is interesting because it tells a particular story at a moment in time. I don't think it speaks necessarily to sentiment in the way that it could. And I think you look at this from a political standpoint, there is not a single political party in the House of Commons that is saying that immigration is bad. Right. And that we should not be bringing more immigrants to this country. And Shamira points out that there is a very large gap upcoming in terms of the difference in terms of people that are retiring versus people that are in the workforce, what that means for our social safety net in this country, what it means for healthcare, what it means for pensions, what it means for the basic fiscal frame of the nation. Sure. And you add on top of that a series of questions around the needs that the country has to sustain the population that it has, let alone a growing population, housing, healthcare, support services, food services, restaurants. I mean, there is a lack of people that are working in this country to keep the country going. And so we have to ask the question, we have to shift, I think, the conversation a little bit, because for a very long time, we have seen immigration, people see immigration, particularly when it comes to vulnerable populations like refugees, as us doing other people a favor. It's a provocative thing to say, but I think for us to look at this and ask the question, how are people that are coming to this country, particularly new refugees, how are they going to help to fill the gaps that we have in this country? And so when you talk about preparation, one of the things that I think we have to talk about is not just domestic preparation, but the question of how do you make sure people that are going to be coming to this country, particularly as refugees that we know are going to be coming, where we've identified populations, how are we making sure that we are setting them up for success here? How are we working with employers in this country? How are we working with the public sector in this country? How are we working with the private sector? How are we working with NGOs to ensure that people that are coming to this country are given the skills that they need, that they're being trained well prior to their arrival? Because one of the big questions that we have to address is how do you deal with social cohesion and social integration in a way that makes communities feel like they remain this thing that we think they are, which is a place where you can come from anywhere and feel like you belong immediately and share who you are. You don't have to hide who you are. Sure. But that only comes when people are able to feel like they can hit the ground, maybe not running the moment they arrive, but in a very, very short amount of time thereafter. And I would argue that when you're looking at a climate where there is anxiety around how do we afford housing, how do we afford to make sure, how do we make sure the healthcare system is working, that we also recognize that in some cases the best way to fill that gap that we have is by bringing people from other parts of the world. And so it's a bit of a paradox, and our job is to figure out how do you not let that paradox devolve into a difficult conversation of us versus them, or close the doors, or I'm here so close the door behind me kind of thing, and instead say, how do we situate the narrative in this country, and how do we situate the narrative of people that are coming to this country as something that is mutually beneficial? And I think that takes a lot more work on the part of government, of civil society, of the private sector, and also in helping to educate and work with everyday Canadians as to why there is a need for us to get to 500,000, why there's a need for that to grow, and what the economic realities would be if we don't. And those are much more nuanced, much more difficult conversations than I think can be communicated in tweets or Instagram videos. But if we care about what we are trying to build in this country, if you care about addressing the issue that Nicholas has raised, and you care about the reality that Shamira presents in that data, we have to be able to invest the time in nuanced, thoughtful conversations that begin from the standpoint of, look, we actually need immigration in this country. It's a question of how do we deal with it, and how do we make sure that those coming and those here are well set up to make the most of that opportunity.
Can I make it a bit more real for you for a moment? You know, yesterday, the cab driver that was dropping me off at the airport, you know, we dropped you guys off, and then he dropped me off at the hotel. And I was talking to him, and he was talking about how the town has changed in the last maybe 5 or 6 years or so. And he said, look, I've never been against immigration once in my life. That's never been the case. But also, my rent has doubled. It's gone from $800 for the apartment that I pay for to $1,500. And that's happened over just a span of 4 years or so. And a consequence of that is it's a consequence of the fact that there's just literally more people looking for housing, and so the cost of housing ends up going up. I don't know what you say to that person. I don't know what you say to that person to say, look, it will be worse in the future if we don't have the amount of immigration we have now. But also, yes, your rent is going up. I realize this is an impossible question. I just thought it'd be fun to throw it to you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. That's why we get paid the big bucks. Look, I've been coming to Charlottetown now for 15 years, and every year, Charlottetown changes. It has been changing, particularly over the last decade. It is more diverse than it's ever been. It has a richness of different cultures, more different types of restaurants and people and faces than you will ever, that I see today. I wouldn't recognize this place from 10 years ago. But comes with that the challenges that you raise. And so I think the question for government, but also for the private sector that is saying, bring us these people, or for the public sector saying, bring us these people to work in healthcare, how are we actually working to unlock more housing more quickly? And this is the paradox that government has been dealing with since probably the last 10 or 15 years. And I think it boils down to this. One is we have to, we've been doing this as a federal government, is really ask provinces and municipalities to address how they are dealing with zoning. And you know what, this turned into like a technical conversation about zoning, but if you come from a place like Vancouver, where up until 2 months ago, almost 90% of the city, you couldn't build multifamily housing. Yeah. I mean, how are you supposed to add supply? And I think this is where what we are doing right now, working with the provinces, working with municipalities, to accelerate how much housing is built by giving tremendous incentive to build housing to the private sector, to public sector, is how you get there. The problem is that people may arrive in 6 months or a year. It doesn't often take 6 months or a year to build a new house or a new condo.
Sure.
And so I think we are dealing with this reality that the taxi driver is facing, which is that there's a short-term amount of pain that people are feeling. But that should be impetus for us to really accelerate together and collectively and sort of move past things that were familiar to us once to a new paradigm that we actually need as we densify and as we bring more people in. And that's going to mean, more people in rural parts of this country where you may have a different type of housing model than you've had before, and certainly more in urban. Mm-hmm. But these are all good things. I mean, these are all good things for us because you're starting to build senses of community in different ways and different shapes. But it doesn't change the short-term pain that people are feeling. There's no question. Yeah. But you have to give them a path out of that, and you have to show them where that's going. If you don't, you do end up with the sentiment that Nicholas is talking about.
Yeah. Nicholas, I have a question for you. Before I get to my question for you, you look like you were scribbling down notes badly. Do you want to address some of the notes you scribbled?
As Taleeb was talking, like I thought of the paradoxes we have experienced historically. I think there have been this belief that, when we bring in immigrants, they will be fine. The feeling always is, it's not what about Canada can do for you. I think that mentality, but what you can do for Canada. Sure. And we know historically that's true. We brought in, the Chinese rail workers, the Indians, the Sikhs, and the domestics from the Caribbean. Yeah. And the system is always, objectify immigrants as commodities. Mm-hmm. And, yes, our immigration system always have the other streams, family reunification, for the refugee humanitarian class. But it's always like built on, what newcomers can do for us. But when resources are scarce, when there's competition for these resources, and we live in that paradox that, Taleeb was talking about, yes, we want you to build Canada, but we don't want you to, take up our healthcare spots, sure. Housing, rental housing, but you cannot have it both ways. And obviously, I think, each region, each province, we all have our own challenges. And I was told last night, someone was telling me, in New Brunswick, housing is not an issue, but they have other challenges. So I feel like we need this kind of dialogue in every single community across Canada to really have that face time, to talk about what the local needs are, how we can do a better job, to have a win-win for newcomers and for the future of Canada.
Are you saying you want to go on the road with all four of us?
Yes, I don't mind.
Let's go. Like a 10-city tour? What are you guys doing? Okay, I'm glad you brought up that point, because I think that's a direct challenge to the narrative about immigration serving this like sort of value-affirming role in the country. Not a challenge, but at least it's sort of like a different alternative interpretation. You know, there's a perception, I think, Nick, that everyone around the world just wants to come to Canada. That's, you know, that this ought to be an obvious thing. You did a story in June, and in June, I want to get the words right, it was like this new immigrant who said, "I respect myself too much to stay." And your story was about immigrants who are coming to this country, leaving after a certain period of time. One of the things that you reported in that story is that about 15 to 20% of people who come to this country, they leave within 10 years. That's, I think, a staggering thing that people maybe not necessarily know about. Why do they leave?
Do you want a short answer or a long answer?
Whatever you feel.
Yes, because what I find very interesting, too, when I was working on that piece, I think we have this romanticized thinking that Canada is so great, people are desperate to come. You know, don't get me wrong, I think Canada is a great country. That's why I come and I stay. And I'm really, you know, I'm passionate for this country. But at the same time, I feel like Canada's immigration system has changed very slowly, when the rest of the world is changing really fast. Look at, you know, I think there are many reasons why we're seeing this, you know, out-migration of immigrants. You know, the rest of the world is changing. The developing countries in the old days, they are now developed. You know, they have like, you know, annual economic growth of like 8%, you know, compared to like 2-3%, you know, here in Canada. But I feel like, you know, we still have the old mindset that, you know, people come and they won't leave, when there actually is a constant truth that people migrate to go after better opportunity, what they believe will give them better opportunities.
Yes.
And I think that is a constant that has never changed. Even today's immigrants, you know, you talk to them compared to like those who came 50, 60 years ago, they would still tell you they come for better opportunities. But I think that the expectations of immigrants actually changed. In the old days, you know, maybe because of technologies, they don't really know about what really is like, you know, to build a new life in Canada, the challenges, the obstacles.
Sure.
And it's too costly for them to move back because, you know, just the plane tickets, you know, would be 2 years' salaries for some people from those parts of the world. So they would lie to themselves that, you know, I'm here, you know, for the second generation. I want them to get a good education and succeed, to be real Canadians. But today's, like, you know, the technologies and, you know, opportunities elsewhere, people, you know, newcomers come with their different expectations. I'm here for myself, you know, especially when our point system, literally now, if you're over 35, you have a really tough time, you know, getting permanent residence in Canada, right? Because you don't get any points after. You know, every year, you know, you get older, every year you lose some points in the point system. So a lot of newcomers, these days, they're without kids. So without that, I wouldn't call it liability, but responsibility may be a better word. You know, they're more mobile. You know, if this, you know, doesn't fulfill my needs, you know, I move somewhere else. And I think that there's a latest report by the Institute of Canadian Citizenship that shows, you know, in 2019, that annual onward migration rate has spiked from around 20%, 21% to 31%. So I think this is something that we didn't think about hard enough, that, you know, we're facing a global race for talent. And, you know, in light of the aging population, the need to, you know, support our social safety, you know, network, you know, we really need to look at how we can support newcomers more, better. I think now it's more neutralized, the power dynamics is more neutralized. And something that I also want to bring into the discussion is about the change of the source countries. You know, since the 80s, we all know that in the old days, we talk about, you know, don't mean to be offensive, but the old stock immigrants, we all know what that means. How the source country actually changed, right? From European-based immigrants, you know, to more, you know, people from Africa, from Asia, from other parts of the world, you know, racialized communities. So I don't know, like, you know, when we talk about, you know, the lack of Canadian experience on all these challenges skilled immigrants actually faced, you know, I think it would be interesting to look at those, the racial dynamics as well, like, you know.
Shamira, the whole time you've been like, I've solved all these problems. We know that immigrants are underutilized in this country. We know that they're underemployed in this country. You exist in the policy space. You're like, hey, I have a plan. Let's talk about some plans. What are 2 3 recommendations for when we think about, for example, how employers could address issues like workplace inclusion in order to hold on to their immigrants.
So as always, I'm going to set some context in terms of what's happening globally, building on what Nicholas has just said. So, you know, the conversation right now is very much about what's happening in Canada and why people are coming and why they're leaving. Globally, we're basically fighting for talent. I was just in the Philippines about 4 weeks ago. And in fact, what the government there said is that they're being visited by every province and every country in the world to try and bring more people into the respective countries. And in fact, one of the things that they talked about in terms of Canada is that they are actually debating whether they're going to come to Canada, especially health workers or those from the occupations where there's so many barriers, because it's way quicker for them to be processed and go to other countries like Australia, Germany. So that's just something that we need to think about in terms of other countries that knew that Canada was an attractive destination, and they're playing up what's happening here in terms of the number of barriers and saying, come to us, we'll process your applications faster, we'll reduce barriers that you face, etc. So that's just something that we need to think about as a country if we want to remain sustainable in the long term. In terms of barriers and, you know, some of the recommendations, I actually see 2 types of recommendations. The first is forums like this are really powerful. You know, I am basically very honored, privileged to work for an organization where I can participate in the forums in different ecosystems, whether it's the settlement community or the licensing community or with employers. But you don't see what we are seeing here today happening across the country. It's, you know, what we're just talking about. How many conversations can you have where you bring different voices together and have joint conversations versus here's what we need to do in settlement, here's what happens in post-secondary. So to me, what becomes really important is joint conversations, but the however is who makes policies and where does majority of the funding come from? And that's from governments. So in fact, I was very pleased to see the recent reports from the federal government, the integrity of the immigration system. 30 action items or recommendations, but all within one ministry that only deals with immigration. When labor market sits with another ministry and the whole issue of health sits in yet another ministry, and one ministry isn't going to be able to deal with the problems that we are talking about, which is complex. And then when you go into the provinces, there are interjurisdictional issues where you have labor market and foreign ministers have a conversation, 5 walk away, it topples the health minister. So I believe that from a systemic and really changing the way we think, I think that there should be a group of ministers sitting in the Prime Minister's office as part of Privy Council, having a joint conversation so that not each minister has to deal with their mandate letters, and at the provincial level, similar, so that when you do have the Council of Federation, they're actually having a joint conversation on the issue of immigration and what that looks like. So that's at the macro level. I understand it's complex. I was a former bureaucrat, but it is possible if you actually start that kind of conversation instead of across political parties, which I understand needs to happen, but truly the way to control this or to hold ministers and ministries accountable is to be in the center where decisions are made and where the funding comes from. If I look at it from basically immigrants themselves and the issues that we're talking about, we need to think about taking almost like a life cycle way of dealing with the issues, because right now there are too many players in terms of who provides the information, how the information is provided, who funds those websites where after 6 clicks it's like, oh, how did I get lost here? The federal government funded this, now go to the province, oh, great, now I'm in the province's website, hold it a minute, now I have to go to Professional Engineers Ontario, oh, I need a course, I have to go somewhere else. So I think that if we really think about a life cycle approach, what is the clearest information that you can give individuals while they're still thinking about coming? and what are the steps and how much will it cost, so that you don't have a situation where we found in a study that we did in 2019, where fully 48% of the immigrants who were surveyed didn't even know that they needed to get licensed in order to practice in the country. They had no idea. They were getting points from the federal government for the human capital. So it's how do we provide information that's clear and factual so people could use their own funding and time to prepare. Immediately after people arrive and when they have the settlement issues, again, it's different people playing different roles, settlement to post-secondary. What's the best way of providing information to people and funding organizations so that you don't have the criteria if you're an international student, you actually can access our services. If we want international students to stay, and in many cases that's the reason why we bring them in, how can you provide support so people can hit the ground running instead of waiting, losing self-confidence, losing their skills that then they even can't apply for licensing because they're no longer able to. And then the last and the most important is we are bringing people in, or they're coming to us because they want to come to Canada not as a commodity, just to fill a job. They're coming here to be part of our fabric, to be Canadian. That's why my parents came from East Africa. He didn't come here to do a job. He couldn't get a job in his profession. He came here because he wanted to come to a new country to basically contribute. And so that last component becomes really important, that we don't talk enough about it. We talk about food and culture, but really the contribution that individuals make. And, you know, the partnership, and, you know, what we heard this morning in terms of, you know, the settlers versus the people who are colonizing, and what's the partnership, and what does that look like? Because we both benefit from, you know, the diversity that people bring, the best practices and what works, the ethics and the values, and it's what we learn about Canada and who we are as a country. And we don't spend enough time talking about identity and what does it mean to be a Canadian. You know, even as you see what is happening in the world around different parts of the world, I personally as a Canadian am disappointed because we're not talking as Canadians. We're talking about my home country there and here's what I'm going to do. And I think, but we're all Canadians, Canadians first. That's my personal opinion. So what is Canadian identity? It isn't always hyphenated. So those are basically in terms of the three solutions, at least not necessarily in a simple society, in a simple way, but at least to be intentional in the way we do it.
Shamira, I think we may need you to get back into the bureaucracy. We can't afford to have you outside of it. So.
I'm perfectly happy doing what I'm doing with World Education Service. Is a great organization. It gives me an opportunity to talk about these things.
I did notice that when you were talking about the way that maybe ministers and ministries are not talking to each other, you didn't turn to me, you turned to Taleeb. And you were like, hey man, just wanted to just pass on this message.
He's influential, he's an MP, he can make a difference.
Well, now I get the chance to ask you this question. I mean, look, there's a real sense of we are still sort of stuck in that mode of human capital, but it's not the most efficient thing in terms of how we incorporate new immigrants into this country's fabric. What do you make of what you just heard?
We're here at the Confederation Center. Charlottetown is the birthplace of Confederation, and ironically, the birthplace of some of the very challenges that we are dealing with today. Because when you have a federation of 10 provinces and 3 territories, different provinces get to decide different things when it comes to things like healthcare, education, housing policy. And so at the federal level, you have the ability to make certain changes. What you can't do, frustratingly sometimes for us, is to dictate exactly how things should go. And so when you talk about the recognition of credentials, not only does this not rest in some cases with the federal government, sometimes it doesn't even rest with the provinces, it rests with the bodies within the provinces, the regulatory bodies within provinces. And there has been a historic reticence. When I was a bureaucrat in the early 2000s, I worked on the question of foreign credentials. This was 3 prime ministers ago. Maybe 4 prime ministers, 3 and 4 prime ministers ago. And we were at that time talking to the professional engineers of Ontario back then to see what could they do to unlock the potential of all of these immigrants who had come to this country as engineers but could not practice their profession. And We have been, we, not government, we, I think, as a society have been very slow, very, very slow, I would say glacial, in pushing regulatory bodies and others to figure out ways to make people able to practice their professions, not just because it's the right thing to do for them, but my goodness, it's because it's the right thing to do for the country.
Sure.
The frustrating thing is that there have always been arguments made, oh, well, their training is different, their this is this, their this is that. Fine. Accept all of that. Then what the heck are we doing here to test that thesis, to make sure that we test their qualifications, we allow them a clear path to use the skills and talents they bring to this country? You know, I'm not saying, oh, you were trained as a doctor in country X, you know, you can practice tomorrow without any kind of verification of all of that. You were trained as an engineer, you shouldn't be. Of course you should go through a process of verification. Of course we should apply rigor in making sure people can practice their professions. But you should not be discounting people based on country of origin. And I think this is something that is incumbent on all of us to really push back a little bit on. Because you start to then, if people feel like they are worthy and worthwhile, and they are able to do the things that they are trained to do when they come to a new country, that increases immediately their sense of belonging in the place that they have come. So that you don't have your taxi driver also being, you know, a neonatal cardiac surgeon from a country and has chosen to come to this country because he wants to be in Canada, and he can't practice his profession at a time when we need neonatal cardiac surgeons in this country. We have to do more, but I think this is also where provincial governments and regulatory bodies need to do their part in saying we are prepared to actually lean in on something that has been historically very uncomfortable to do because it is now a necessity. The other thing that I want to say very quickly is when it comes to the federal government's role in being able to impose solutions, this is something that A, you just can't do, and B, when you live in an environment and climate that is politically charged like the one that we are in, sometimes provinces will do things just to be provocative. But if the national interest or the interest of citizens is what we put foremost in our mind, we should be asking the question, as political leaders, how do we put scoring points aside and actually get to solving the problem that we have? And that takes two things, I think. One, it takes a substantial amount of courage to accept that people from different parties or different levels of government may have a good idea. And B, it requires a tremendous amount of humility that comes with, I think, one's own sense of confidence that just because you have chosen to listen and engage with somebody that comes from a different sort of political sphere or a different jurisdiction, that you actually might get to the right outcome for the people that we all serve. At the end of the day, there's one taxpayer, there is one voter, and there is one Canadian. It's not like we are all dealing with the same citizens. And that, to me, as somebody who's been elected recently, is the one thing I try to keep in the back of my mind. But I think it needs to be at the top of all of our minds when we're having conversations like this.
That's what they call earned media in the biz. I think I probably have time for like one or two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to you guys. So this is to all of you, but I'll start with you, Nicholas. In 2015, all the MPs and all the premiers in Atlantic Canada were Liberals, and all of them said, we want immigration. They got it in about maybe a 15-year period, 2006, 2021. Atlantic Canada has tripled its share of the pie of new immigrants that come to this country. And it's worth noting it did that while the pie itself doubled in size in that period of time. The two fastest growing cities in the country last year were Moncton and Halifax. When you see that, what comes to mind for you? What comes to mind in terms of one region's ability to absorb that much change in such a short period of time? What are the questions that come to mind? What are maybe worries or also signs that, hey, this is like progressing well? What do you look for?
The first thing that came to my mind is actually, it speaks to me that the success of Canada's immigration system to spread the benefits of the diversity of the different perspectives, new lived experience to the rest of Canada. Because for a long time, I think successive federal governments talked about how do we regionalize immigration. So, the smaller communities could also, have the bodies there for population growth, for economic growth. And so that's the first thing that came to my mind, maybe, we're moving towards that direction, so to spread the benefits. And also, I think it's interesting that, even back in the 90s, there were talks about, does Toronto and Montreal, Vancouver can really absorb, these many newcomers because they all tend to concentrate in the big three cities.
Sure.
But then now, when we are seeing them moving outward, then we have other concerns. So again, I just feel, we don't live in a perfect world and we can always find something to complain about.
So what are the worries that come to mind then? Are there worries that come to mind?
We are bound to have challenges, and also, I think one thing that, I don't know whether you guys remember, even in the 90s, in Markham, a town in Ontario, suddenly within a few years, there's a shot, the population of Chinese actually, shot up. And, locals started seeing all these Chinese signages, and
Sure.
the deputy mayor was talking about, whether there's too many Chinese in Markham. And I think, when you grow a population, you grow diversity in a very short period of time, you're bound to have those challenges. But again, how we handle those challenges is, I don't see it as a challenge to absorb, because obviously, we have a huge, country in Canada. Maybe we are lacking infrastructure and resources in some places. But I feel, those tensions between people is something that I'm more concerned about than the actual infrastructure. If you come with the right mindset, with an open mind and open heart to deal with each other, human to human, I think all issues can be resolved when you can show respect at the table. I think it's the mindset, the kind of dialogues like what we're having now. Yeah.
Taleeb, what about you?
I'm eternally an optimist.
That's good.
Serves you
Glad
well.
there's a bunch of us on the stage.
Serves you well in politics.
Yeah.
We have to, I think, going back to what we had said earlier, I think there is an opportunity for us in this country to really reshape the narrative around immigration at a time when quite literally the world is on fire, both in terms of climate change and in terms of political instability everywhere.
Sure.
And we are in this fight that Shamira talks about for talent. But we're also facing a world where we are going to see more and more and more migration as a result of climate change, as a result of conflict, as a result of economic uncertainty in other parts of the world. And Canada is still, as much as people may come here and then leave, is still one of the, if not the preferred destination. So if we assume that that is the case, and it's going to be the case for the next 20 to 50 years, then I think the opportunity for us is to start saying, how do we plan across levels of government, across the public and private sector, for what that looks like?
Sure.
What does it look like in terms of investments in housing, investments in training, investments in, in skill development prior to arrival, in investments to physical infrastructure? But also, how do we start to use this as a way to exert global influence in a different kind of way, right? We always hear this expression, the world needs more Canada. Right, fine. What the heck does it actually mean? To me, it actually means if we build a country here where we model a substantially different way of doing things than perhaps the U.S., with a very pluralistic ethos, which looks at climate change as an opportunity, one that looks at innovation as a way for us to move forward, but also then says, if you can bring people from different parts of the world here and use that as a strength to build capital, not just here, but around the world, to build capacity around the world, and then to use it as a driver for economic growth, I think the way people start to look at immigration changes. Right? If we can move past what I would call a very historically patronizing approach to immigration, one that is driven by the notion of commoditization, one that is driven by this idea of necessity, and we move it to a conversation around opportunity, which a lot of people pay lip service to. But if we actually lean into the concept of immigration as opportunity for Canada as an economic engine, I think you start to tweak a whole bunch more people's interest in being part of that. It's tough. It's going to be difficult in the short term when people are dealing with some very real challenges around affordability. But it's something that if everybody actually starts to think about at community level, at organizational levels in terms of NGOs, at municipal levels, at federal levels, at provincial levels, in the private sector, I think you end up with a pretty interesting conversation that most other countries right now either are not having or may not be ready to have.
I like that picture, but I want to present you with the photo negative of that picture.
Sure.
Because I think the photo negative of that picture is a story of Canada as an experiment, and you go, is this experiment working or is it not working? And moments when you feel it not working are moments when you go, okay, in moments of high inflation, a housing crisis, an affordability crisis, maybe this is not the time to ramp up immigration, and we cannot have the same relationship to immigration that we do now as we do during maybe like a boom period. And it's not like the population is not going to be sensitive to those triggers. But that ends up raising is this very, I think, very valid question of, is it working? Is it working for this country? And that's not the question I'm going to give you because you're an optimist. You've already tipped your hand. But the question maybe is, if it's working, how do we tell it's working?
Well, I think you just need to look at what happened during COVID, when the number of people coming to this country was not where it needed to be. And you are now seeing the result of people not having employees, people not having the workers that they need, right? So when you start to say, we're gonna slow this down, or we're gonna start to say, we don't have the ability to absorb today, it's not like the time stops and needs stop. Needs keep growing, and then you have a deficit in terms of what you actually need in terms of people. So when things are easy, it's very easy to point to things and say, look how things are going well. I think it's when times are tough that you have to look at the story and ask the question, how much worse would it be? How much worse would it be if we didn't have enough people working in the healthcare system, if we didn't have more people here to build the houses, if we didn't have people to serve our coffee at Tim Hortons, right? If you didn't have that, where would you be today? And how do you then meet that gap? Do you wait until inflation goes back down? The challenge is that we are doing much better than most of the G7. And if you look at the OECD numbers from yesterday, we're doing miles better than almost all of the OECD at every economic indicator. But if you stop doing this very thing that people look at as the boogeyman sometimes, the economic consequences, the social consequences that you then have to deal with once that inflationary period is over are substantially graver than dealing with them today. And so I always ask the question, you know, how much worse could it be? And it's a terrible question to ask, but if you don't actually ask that question, then you're living in this world of what if. And I actually think that we have an obligation to say to people exactly what you've said. It is working. Here's how it's working. Here is what would have happened if we didn't keep doing this. And by the way, if people felt that way, you would hear people on the other side of the House of Commons saying, hey, slow this down. But they're not saying that because everybody in that place who disagrees about pretty much everything recognizes that we would have a substantial problem as a country if we did this. And that's why provincial governments, municipalities, the federal government are all saying the same thing. Yes, keep immigration going, but deal with some of the issues that we're having. And I think that's the difference, and I think that's the story of why it is actually working.
Shamira, this is going to be my last question before we sort of open it up to people, so maybe this is an opportunity for you guys to start thinking about what your questions might be. You've had a lot of experience in this. You've had a lot of experiences in walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? Because what we're trying to do is a bunch of different levers and a pretty complex and wide system. How do you manage that complexity in order to actually achieve results? Because it's one thing to sort of say, this is what we hope to do. It's another to try to accomplish it. What does that look like?
So I'm always going to start with what Nicholas said, because it has stayed with me. I live in Markham, in Ontario. And it's still one of the largest populations. And yet the experiment is working. And the reason why the experiment is working is because it isn't about, you know, who's coming in and what's the largest population. It's about the politicians being respectful of who's coming in. It's about employers playing a significant role. It's about immigrants setting up businesses. And it's about living in a society that's basically respectful. And so for me, that experiment in terms of what had happened years ago to where we are at today is working. You started the conversation with Moncton, New Brunswick, and we were there with some organizations probably about 2 months ago. And that experiment is working too. Why isn't New Brunswick having similar issues in terms of some of the angst and challenges that are being put out there with housing pricing and all that, which is happening, but what the difference is that you have the politicians who basically are listening, who are consulting with those who are being impacted, who are working with the local employers and the post-secondary institutions, so it's a joint conversation. And so a very concrete example is that there was what's called the refugee hiring event, where basically refugees work with organizations that support them to basically be successful when they go for an interview. So it's like executive search firms.
Sure.
Employers are there, and they literally, the refugees come in, they're getting jobs on the spot most of the time. Wow. Even where some of the refugees barely spoke English, but they could use their hands to do the work that's necessary until they get language proficiency. That experiment is working because people chose to work together. When we look at the whole issue of international students as an example, which is the negative narrative that's playing out, too many students coming in, fraudulent documents, it's a very small minority. International students have brought in $22 billion worth in terms of what they're putting into the system. Every province they're going to, they basically are buying appliances, buying furniture, setting up whatever it takes, and it actually makes communities robust where, you know, people would have just left and it had died down. So in my mind, what's working just generally from a macro perspective is bring people in. What we do need to do, and that's the question you've asked me, is, you know, been around for a long time, what are the steps that one takes? I think that, again, we have to be very intentional in terms of information right at the onset, so that we're authentic and very transparent with people as to what they're going to be able to do when they get here, how long it's going to take. Two is that when they get here, there are the different components. You talk about credential recognition. There are different components of credential recognition. The assessment of academic credentials, we have solved. You know, we're a 50-year-old organization. You bring your diploma or credential, we'll give you the assessment according to Canadian standards. The issue is, how do you take somebody's experience and competences and translate it to the way we work in Canada? And so it's always, you don't have Canadian experience. And really the proxy for that is, I don't know how I'm going to translate your 15 years of experience into my workplace, and I have a bottom line. And so that then becomes a conversation that needs to take place on what are the tools. How do you get people, rather than writing an exam that's going to take 2 years and $200,000 worth, to demonstrate the competency? And how do you do that? And employers did that, and you have, as you have just heard during COVID, where we basically magically said, okay, you don't need to have Canadian experience. You can basically, you know, demonstrate your competency, or you don't need to do another language test because you already did your language test for immigration purposes. So to me, that second part of the conversation in terms of, you know, how you make sure that people come, are able to demonstrate the skills and hit the ground running, become really important. And it is, in my mind, working because you do have regulators, as much as we are basically saying, you know, the gatekeepers, which many are, where they are willing to have a conversation and they are willing to put tools on the table. They just need to have the funding to be able to talk about what that looks like, demonstrate best practices, and then move on. And as I said, the third part is employers. So, you know, I'll give you the negative and the positive side of what employers do. So probably the positive side is, we need immigrants, where are they, bring them in. The negative side is, when you have the number of individuals who are in our workplace, including international students, it's okay to pay the minimum wage. It's okay not to worry about employment standards, because people are desperate, especially if they're temporary foreign workers. And you end up with a situation where employers are saying, I actually don't really care about how well you do. As long as I can pay you minimum wage and you work 110 hours and, you know, I get what I need, I'm okay. That's not okay. That's where the governments and, you know, whether it's labor market, where ministries need to play a role on employment standards and prevent employers taking advantage of vulnerable populations who are so desperate to stay, they'll do whatever is necessary. So, you know, I feel that employers could and should play a role, but it has to be in a way to build a country versus for their own benefits in terms of just making a ton of money.